geluba naqdogliyo nugal waa ku darara melay nabadi joogta.
Welcome to ISIRKA. My name is Amina Isir, and join me as I take you on a journey to explore identity, culture, and belonging. Take a seat as I take you through time, space, and various perspectives of cultural identity. Stay tuned to see where the journey will take us today. Welcome back to another episode of ISIRKA. And this episode will feature Sagal Ali of the Somali Arts Foundation, the first or the newest art gallery based in Mogadishu. It's such an honor to kind of speak to her, to learn a little bit more about her work and how, people are responding to the gallery. If you'd like to learn more about the gallery and Sagal's work, you can feel free to check them out. Recently was a BBC article written about the Somali Arts Foundation, in which two women, or it might have been three, in which a few women shared their work publicly. One of them was Firdousa Hussein, the other one was Hannah Mire. And Firdousa Hussein's image of the young girl is what I've been using for this season's artwork. Hannah Mirna and Samia Usman recently just also presented the same exhibit in New York, and I had an opportunity to see them there, and it was so nice to see a piece of Somalia brought to New York and for the diaspora to also appreciate. So it's really great to see work that's happening both at home and in the diaspora at the same time. I think that's kind of what will bring about the best synergy when it comes to what this Somali identity and cultural expression is going to look like in the next few years to come. So enjoy this conversation and stay tuned for another episode. So welcome, Sagal. It's such a pleasure to welcome you to ISIRKA.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me, Amina.
Could you tell me more about yourself and the Somali Arts Foundation?
Sure. So my name is Sagal Ali. I grew up in a small Scandinavian country called Denmark, in the capital, Copenhagen. And then I subsequently studied in London, in the United Kingdom. So my background is in contemporary arts, performance, and cultural heritage. That is actually one of the reasons that I went back for the first time to Somalia, Mogadishu more specifically, back in 2015, to work on a project that was seeking to leverage culture for peace building. I would actually say that I feel like a returnee. That's probably a more apt description of how I feel. When I'm in Somalia, I feel that I'm a Somali daughter, that yes, although I was born in Hamad, I didn't grow up there. And I'm not also in denial of that. I can't erase, most of my life having spent in Denmark and in the UK and other countries. That is just a fact of my particular life. But then I returned, to a place that I consider my homeland, but also a place where I find the most meaning in my life to want to contribute to, right? And that was, for me, a personal choice I made. My own family, my immediate family aren't in Somalia. Actually, I don't have much family in Somalia left. So that was a personal sort of decision I made. So I feel that I'm a citizen of Hamad. I'm a citizen of Somalia. I'm sort of resident of Hamad. I'm a resident of Somalia. But more importantly, because it was something I chose, I'm a returnee, right? So yes, I'm Somali Danish. Yes, I'm all the other things I've also experienced. But the way that I feel when I'm in Somalia is that I've returned. In my own way to contribute however I can. And the reason I also say returnee is because my feeling of being in Somalia also changed actually when I relocated there more permanently and I lived there, because it was the first time that I actually felt in my life that I was somewhere where I truly belonged. It was a feeling that I hadn't had before, before I'd almost have to sort of either justify or fight for my right to be a Black European woman, Muslim, all of the other categories or labels that we sort of carry with us. But in Somalia, I'm just another Somali. And when I've sort of paid attention to those feelings, I've sort of started to really kind of, go with the punches. And I've realized that is the only place in the world that, as we sort of commonly might say in Somalia, it's like, I somehow have an ancestral claim to this land. So everything else then becomes secondary, right? The ideas of belonging. Then when I'm there, it might be like, okay, sometimes my Somali can be a little bit, you know, still I have to work on that. Or, you know, maybe people won't understand the way I do X, Y, and Z because I normally do it another way. So it became of something sort of different rather than belonging. And then through sort of the last 5 years, having worked more progressively and more in-depth in the cultural sector, both from governmental aspect, UNESCO, and from sort of local grassroots priorities as well, I was then able to start my own art foundation, which was a very sort of a lifelong dream, if I can say so far. So yeah, that was the birth of SAF, which we launched September 2020. And so SAF, as we endearingly call the Somali Arts Foundation, it's basically an independent institution that seeks to support the revival of the creative industries, which sadly has been one of the sectors that have been very much impacted by our recent traumatic past, that we're sort of still enduring, I guess, to some extent. And yeah, we're concerned with leveraging contemporary art in all its formats, so visual arts, spoken word, music, composition, to have, you know, critical discourses and engage in critical discourses and have important conversations about identity, belonging, community, and self-expression. So we support primarily artists, young people, particularly those from marginalized backgrounds, to be able to themselves sort of find their voice and their creativity, but also to be, you know, home for art induction, as there so far is a complete absence of either courses or programs in any formal educational system that actually is about art, whether in theory or in practice. So we're one of the things that we're working towards is being able to give accredited courses. And then, yeah, beyond that, we also do events and we support artists in being able to put their work on display and selling their work so they can make a livelihood. So yeah, we're sort of a one-stop shop for for arts and creativity. In Mogadishu so far, we do have networks across the Somali regions, and the idea eventually also is that we'll have offices and galleries either under SAF or in collaboration with other cultural or artist institutions.
That's great, and that's so exciting. The identity culture piece and the self-expression is a lot of what I talk about a lot and what I harp on, especially in a Somali context. And that's what will be needed as we kind of think about development, you know, within our societal context as well. And even though you haven't been open that long, could you speak a little bit to the progress and the response that the Somali Arts Foundation has received so far?
Well, thank you for that question, Amina. Well, the response has been incredible, actually. We've been quite surprised. Like, we were anticipating, because SAF sought to fill a vacuum, right? We did anticipate that we would be well received, especially from artists, budding artists, and, you know, anyone sort of interested in creativity and self-expression. But it went far beyond our initial expectation, and it's been very heartwarming. The welcome, the encouragement, the support we've had from the community, from young people, from women groups. It's been really wonderful experience. But I think it speaks more, you know, to actually the reason SAF was, you know, created to start with, that there is a hunger for these spaces, right? That there is a hunger for people being able to come together, to discuss, to bask in creativity, having, you know, conversations about what the meaning a particular art piece or creativity in of itself can have. And I think a lot of it's to do with the fact that creativity, arts, and culture are inherently human forms of expression and human needs. Like some of the oldest remnants we have of a mark that testifies to the fact that humans have existed are cave paintings, right? That go back thousands and thousands of years, where, humans would literally create sort of a natural dye paste, right? And imprint their own fingerprint, handprint on inside caves, right? So we've always had the need as humans to express ourselves creatively. So I think part and parcel of the sort of warm reception staff has so far enjoyed has been because there's been a complete absence of these spaces for people to gather, to engage with around arts and creativity.
All right, shameless question, but how could those who are interested in supporting the Somali Arts Foundation do so? Those that are at home and in the diaspora?
Well, there's so many different ways to get involved. So in terms of support for us, the way we work is in terms of synergy. So we exist only because there's a need for us, and our need kind of satisfies the sort of in of itself. So it kind of goes around in circle, if that makes sense, right? So, the fact that people get involved with our events, our programming, and we're very collaborative, we're very open. That's one way, sort of more directly. You can also get involved by actually supporting some of our programs and initiatives. So whilst now, we don't necessarily just go after direct philanthropic help in terms of just cash, what we also really encourage people to do also is actually to see insofar as they believe in our principles. So for example, if you're someone who's very particularly keen on photography and you want to support our photography club for young girls, right? You could do that directly, whether you want to donate a camera or somehow fund our programming. So that there's that kind of actual programming support that you can get involved with. Of course, we, like any other art institution, we accept normal donations and also in-kind donations as well. So, for example, if you're a creative yourself in the diaspora, in the Somali diaspora in particular, and you want to come and share your skills, we do artist residencies as well, that you can come, whatever your trade is, that you can come and directly sort of coach, mentor the young people we work with. So there's a myriad of ways. And then we also very much, as I said before, work in synergy. So we're very open to collaborations and things like that, based, of course, again, around different mediums of art expression and creativity. So there's, the possibilities are quite a few.
Okay, great. I feel like the arts and culture is a space that we all have, right? Like it's a medium, like a middle ground, especially between like the diaspora and those back home, but also like in terms of just supporting Somali cultural production. That's like everybody always wants to buy tangible artifacts or art pieces to hang up in their house, And so giving people an opportunity to do that also would then kind of increase like the cultural heritage piece, increase like our cultural heritage and our cultural production. For example, like when I was at the airport in Mogadishu, I bought a postcard of what Hamar looked like back in the days, and I probably could have just it was the same thing as what I would have seen on Pinterest, for example, but I have no problem buying a postcard when I'm in a European country, so why not buy something, on Somali soil that is very much reflective of what we were, what the city used to look like, of our history. And also, I then went to Via Roma and I bought handmade sandals. And I very much bought them, and now I'm becoming like a herdo. I just tell people, I bought these in Mogadishu, like, and they're not just like or like these are like handmade, like special artifacts that will kind of have its own story.
Oh, that's great. We love collectors like you in particular.
So even when it comes from, like a cultural aspect, there's so much that's still left there in Mogadishu that's present despite all the destruction. So how were you able to kind of navigate that or make sense of what you knew beforehand and what you've seen in front of you? And how did that then inform your work?
Well, so my kind of engagement with the art and cultural sector has kind of been in twofold. So I initially came to work on cultural heritage project in Somalia. So I first came on an EU project called Revive Culture Building Peace. That was sort of the first of its kind, that for the first time in sort of the humanitarian kind of sort of campaign, I guess, the culture was utilized in a slightly more formalized way to leverage peace building. So I did that, but then I once that's finished, I kind of wanted to work sort of more practically with heritage, and that's when I sort of worked directly with the Somali government, in particular the Ministry of Education and Culture and Higher Education, to help directly with reviving the cultural sector. So through all of those engagements, it became very clear to me when I got to the point of wanting to set up SAF that there was a lot of sort of misconceptions on the ground. First and foremost, that there's a misconception that a lot of young people necessarily now in Somalia wouldn't perhaps know, right? Which is that we're not very creative. The Somalis aren't creative. If it's not about the spoken word, that in terms of sort of visual expression or artifacts and making sort of crafts, that we're not very creative, which is a complete fallacy. Because also a lot of young people would be under the age of 30. We are one of the youngest nations in the world, right, in terms of age demographic. So I found that really interesting, where I'd come across sort of the older generations who are very sort of emotionally attached to the artifacts, to the gabai, the different cultural traditions, and lament, either their loss or how they've changed, or maybe how young people aren't as interested. And then you have young people who either only know one way of engaging with creativity, which is the sort of the canonical, Somali heritage, which is all the artifacts you so beautifully described just before. So there was a lot of misconceptions that I found, that I was able to kind of decipher, because I learned about the sort of cultural and art industry as a formalized way through education, but also practicing it in different places around the world before I even came to Somalia. So I thought it would be refreshing, as well as also necessary, to, when I was setting up my own art institution, to focus more exclusively on contemporary art rather than cultural heritage and sort of the cultural artifacts. While those things, of course, always will inform, the past will always inform the present to some extent. But I really wanted to highlight this idea of using creativity and art as a tool to interrogate your environment, because that's what contemporary art it really is when you boil it down to its most simplified idea, right? It's a tool to which you use to examine your environment. So if we're constantly asking young people under the age of 30, whom form the vast majority of the Somali population, to constantly look exclusively at the past, exclusively as these heydays before the Somali civil strife, right? As this time of euphoria, beauty, nationhood, and what have you, as the only time for creativity, then I think we're losing sight of what creativity and art really is. It's something that is not time bound. It exists always, and it's something to engage with always. So I basically wanted to take creativity out of that shackle that people only associated it with, our dances, our language, the beautiful poetry that we're so well known for, and kind of open it up a little bit and put a more contemporary sort of spin on it and say, okay, let's look at contemporary art. Let's look at utilizing art as a tool to understand our environment, to have dialogue, to discuss art in of itself for the sake of it. So yeah, that's kind of how SAF has managed to formulate it, a little bit away from what I was doing before, but I think perhaps a little bit more applicable to our times.
And a lot more future facing. I think a lot of times when people think about the country, they think about the heyday, they think about waxa la soo maray, life before the state collapse. But a lot of what you've just said grounds us in reality. It grounds us in the present. It's been 30 years since the conflict began in Somalia. A whole generation has come about, and these young people have only known this conflict. So how are they navigating or trying to make sense of what they see now, and knowing that the Somali arts and cultural space always was traditionally a space for older men. When you even think about like the greatest love songs or the most feminist songs that, you know, Finaninta used to sing, or like that Somali female artists used to sing back in the days, a lot of them were written by men. And so I don't even really understand how to make sense of that. I just appreciate the fact that music exists out there. But then when you think about now, these young people are growing up in a space and a time where a lot of the norms of whatever existed before the state collapse are not there, and are taking up space and have a lot more agency when it comes to their self-expression, their creativity, their arts, because there's nobody to gatekeep it in the way that people were before. How are they responding to that, and what does that look like now, in your opinion? And how are they creatively imagining their futures and expressing, you know, what they would like for the future?
Yeah, well, they're hungry. That's like, if I can really boil down to my first impression with, you know, working with young people, and young people have always been, you know, the people that I've always preferred working with, because I think they're the future. And most importantly, I also think that they're willing to shape a future, right? That's not seeped in history alone. So, but the main thing is that they're hungry. They're hungry for opportunity. They're hungry for diversity. They're hungry for their capacities and their desires to be real, right? And sadly, Somalia still, wherever you look, is predominantly governed by middle-aged men, right? That's just a fact. And so the youth is changing. It is changing, I have to say and admit to, but not quite quick enough. The youth don't have, comparatively to their size and population, they don't have as much say in leadership, in civil governance, in politics, of course. And obviously, because of that, also that means that, you know, they don't have as much money, right? Because again, you know, entrepreneurship, of course, does exist, but there's just far too many numbers in terms of how many youth are qualified and capable to have a job. And yeah, so they're hungry. And when I speak to young people about their aspirations and what they want, it's like they're definitely the most sort of, you know, visionary and kind of really think in terms of future. And I think, of course, one big fact in all of this is, and I don't think it's only specific to Somalia, it's a global phenomenon, but social media, you know, most people now have a smartphone. And through that tool, you also have access to how the world lives and different ideas and different things and what have you. And so aspirations of the youth are not just localized, they're also global. So I really think the Somali youth population, given the right opportunities, they're really an incredible force to reckon with.
Okay, I just like to go back real quick. Did you say the first time you came back to Somalia is when you started working there?
Yeah, so I got the job with the first project I worked on, which was the EU project that looked at peace building through sort of a cultural lens. End of 2015. So I actually came to Mogadishu for the first Mogadishu book fair. I literally came, I think, a day or two before for that, but also that was the first time I'd come to Somalia after I was born there. So I do have some claim of to Somalia. I was born in Mogadishu just before the civil war broke out, sadly. And of course, we left as a consequence. But yeah, that was my first time I came to Somalia, and it was for work.
So then how did you navigate that experience? Could you speak a little bit more as to what that was like for you? You know, for somebody now who's listening and they're living in the diaspora and they'd like to come home, but they have no idea how to make it work. Could you kind of give them, walk them through a little bit of like how that reality was like for you, and like kind of some pro tips as to how to best navigate that?
Sure. So for me, like, I didn't really have a plan to set anything up when I first came. It was literally, you know, I came, got headhunted for this particular project. I came to do that, and I was very passionate. I've always, academically and in my work, focused on art, museum work, cultural heritage, from the vantage point of either social change or going, you know, back in the archives and excavating hidden histories. And my focus was always either the sort of African diaspora, but more kind of in depth about Somali sort of cultural expression in the diaspora, and especially in second generation Somalis, like I guess ourselves, but also kind of Somalia as the sort of homeland, if you like. So for me, it was also kind of coming out and testing some hypotheses, I guess. That's the academic me talking, you know, like I wrote, for example, my thesis on I wanted to apprehend this kind of connection I seem to share with so many other Somalis who grew up in the diaspora, that we are so connected to this homeland, so-called homeland, a lot of the times through our principles, our moral cues, and then that we, of course, so obviously identify ourselves as Somali, you know, whether you're Somali Dane or Somali American, or, you know, we are first and foremost Somali. So I've always been, you know, I was always preoccupied with all those things. So of course, for me, it made perfect sense to come to Somalia and in sort of in real life, I guess, interact with these theories, but also practically how things are. And of course, apply myself and, you know, offer anything I have to as part of my sort of little contribution to the rebuilding of Somalia. So I didn't really have a plan beyond the job at hand. But then, you know, things always have a way of naturally evolving. So from that project, it was very clear to me when I completed the project that actually it wasn't feasible for me to continue working sort of from the inside out, either for, you know, a third party institution or an NGO that worked in Somalia. I felt after that project that for me personally, it really didn't sit correctly, that I was there to somehow contribute and I wasn't really going at the heart of the issue. And that's when I then accepted to work with the government to support rebuilding the cultural sector, because that was more real to me. You know, if I'm there to actually do something, I really wanted to apply myself directly, whether that was with the Somali sort of institution or the government. Of course, the government made sense because that was where I could mostly apply of all the skills and education I have, which honestly isn't very much needed in the places I've grown up in, because there's thousands, if not millions of me, right? But sadly in Somalia, there aren't, at least to my knowledge, many cultural heritage and museum professionals working on the ground. So my skill set all of a sudden became something that was needed, and I could directly apply. So I did that. And then, you know, I was very grateful to being given the opportunity to really apply everything I had acquired before coming to Somalia, to support the Ministry of Education and Culture to revive the cultural sector. And then I've been doing that, and we ratified historic UNESCO conventions, which I'm very proud to have supported. We reestablished the UNESCO commission Somalia also had, which in fact hadn't been working since '88. So we made huge sort of strides in the cultural sector. And then sort of I've been doing that, of course, for a number of years now. And then when I recently in November once, I had I felt that I had kind of come to a point where I had supported the ministry to build the sector, it came to a natural sort of transition again, and that's when SAF was born, right? So did this important bit of work with the government, and then I was really yearning to directly work with the young people who often come to me and say, because sadly there's not a lot of cultural projects on the ground. So because I've been doing this work with the government, a lot of young people saw that I was quite active in the cultural sector. So they would approach me and say, you know, things like, is there a way that you can directly work and encourage young artists, for example? And that wasn't really my mandate then, because things were more, you know, eminently needed at the strategic level and institutional level. So SAF kind of came at the sort of behest of young people, but also I always wanted a gallery. But then sort of the middle ground was to have a foundation then that would seek to support young artists and creatives directly, while also having a commercial gallery attached to it that actually supports the livelihood of artists, right, by exhibiting and selling their work. So all of that really to say that one thing led to the next, and then so on. I didn't really have, you know, a 5-year plan, if you like, when I arrived. And this was the year 5, although I have kind of been on the ground on and off for the last 5 years, and all of these have happened. But yeah, it was a natural progress, really. And also I kind of grew in myself and adapted to how things are, and kind of, you know, you sort of mutate with your environment as well. So yeah, it's been a sort of gradual growth, really.
It's always so great hearing people's stories. It seems like a lot of people might have come for one thing or another, and then it just kind of grew. Things take momentum, and then they end up staying. But I wanted to ask you, were you a part of when the National Museum or the National Library opened, as well as the National Theatre? Were you a part of that work?
I still have one role actually with the ministry. I'm still the senior advisor for art and heritage. But I was also, when we reestablished the National Commission for UNESCO, I was also I was basically the managing secretary general. So I was the deputy secretary general for the commission. So I basically had 2 hats. So on the one hand, I supported the ministry developing our membership in UNESCO, essentially. So all the UNESCO work that we did through that, like the conventions and things like that. But then more strategically, it was also, you know, kind of how do we practically revive the cultural sector? And of course, institutional building was the first and foremost important thing. With the library, the museum, and the theatre, that was actually started by when the current administration came in. One of the first, I think, important things that they did was actually focus on our cultural signifiers, right? So the museum, the library, the theatre, and the statues. Yeah, exactly. So that was that project. But of course, everyone had sort of everyone whose mandate those were had an impact an impact on that. So from the ministry that I work with, our mandate, of course, is the museum and the library. The theatre comes actually under the Ministry of Information. So the management of that is with the ministry. But so we were sort of responsible for developing capacity building projects. And I'm really pleased that we got direct support for the museum in particular, to build capacity with the current staff, but also to really institutionalize the museum.
Oh, okay. So is the museum open now for the public, or is it still being worked on?
It's still kind of being worked on. Like of course, one of the saddest things that happened during conflict is the almost complete looting of national resources and treasures, right? So the museum was completely looted. So it doesn't have any collections yet. But the work in the museum is also still ongoing. They're in the final stages of completing the work. And I'm sure the people now responsible for the museum are probably thinking about acquiring collections, and how to actually create a community organization, because I'm of the opinion that any cultural institution should really be community orientated. Then that's how you actually get a useful institution out of it, rather than an archaic building that just boasts of ethnographic artifacts. I'm not a fan of the old museum model. So yeah, there's still a little bit of work left from my knowledge. I unfortunately, well, not necessarily unfortunately, but that was kind of the job that I don't do anymore, that I recently resigned from, was more sort of involved with the museum. But to the bit that I was involved in, it was to secure capacity building projects for the museum, which I'm happy we managed to do.
Okay, so to kind of go into the second question, you mentioned earlier that you kind of went on the ground really to kind of test out your hypotheses about the Somali diaspora and how they understand themselves and their identity. So what were you able to understand by being there?
Well, so I've always had this hypothesis that has guided all my work, which is this overarching hypothesis that without art, there's no life. And without art, there's no peace. The reason I think this is because I firmly believe that art is where we make meaning and connections, and where we make sense of our environment. And take that away, I don't think we're truly living. And one of the first, if not the first casualty of war seems to be our sense of belonging, place, history, art, right? If you think of, back on sort of any recent conflict, even, for example, Syria, the sad affair of Syria, when the Allied forces went in, some of the first things, or not actually even the Allied forces, when the ISIS attack, it happened around museums. One of the biggest things that always gets attacked, or even Timbuktu, right, is libraries, museums, because when you wage war, I believe you very firmly understand your enemy, or at least your perceived enemy, and in order to truly hurt a human, you need to erase them from history. And how do you do that? By erasing their cultural heritage, because that's our signifier that we exist, that we belong, that we're important, that we are communities, right? And that's what culture and art is. It's things that are created either collectively or individually to talk to the collective. So it's where we make meaning. And in any successful sort of scenario where there's been sustained peace, art has played a tremendous importance in that process. So my hypothesis essentially was, I think art is fundamentally important, and culture to peace building in Somalia. And I'm glad that I've had the opportunity to test that across all my work, quite naturally, actually. And my conclusion is that it's completely true. We need to develop the creative industries, because you can't starve people from expressing and creating. It's such an innate human thing, whether we're doing, arts and crafts. And often they're actually tools, right? The carver will carve out the nomadic pillow. That's all instruments that are used in actual life, but that are created. So creativity, it's very important. And we need to develop that in Somalia. And we need to create independent spaces, or allow independent spaces to flourish, because creativity is the only thing that can't be owned either by government or an institution or a certain person, right? It's the one thing that we need to give space to flourish. And I think actually our future depends on it.
Very well said. And just to kind of follow up on that, I wanted to ask, in a society like ours that is now so repressive, post-Civil War and post-state collapse, And I like the fact that you talked about the cultural artifacts as being art and form of self-expression, because that's not something I automatically would have thought of. A lot of times, like when you look at something like music that is still very contested within our society, that's kind of looked at as like something that's wrong or bad. But something like creating these nomadic artifacts that are very much instruments that are used on a regular basis cannot be contested against who we are as Somalis. You know, dadka miyiga waxaas way u baahan yihiin, but also even dadka miyiga jooga way heesaan, you know, when they're working, when they're doing things. So that's also a part of our culture and our expression. So how do you navigate this? How do you navigate the society or the present tense that we're in now that is so repressive, and still manage to have a space to have self-expression through arts and culture?
No, that's a good question. Yeah. No, I guess I see that, well, twofold. Firstly, I think I'm able to understand and apprehend, like you so succinctly just said as well, like how this has the sort of like the kind of suppression of expression, and whether that's physical or otherwise, right? And it's quite symptomatic historically. It's quite symptomatic of when a nation such as ours goes through a conflict, right? One of the first things that sort of is taken away is liberty, and liberty in its sort of like basic form isn't about, you know, how sometimes it's lauded around the world about free speech, where no, liberty in of itself is that you as a human are able to express yourself without any fear how you feel you are, of course within the context of your community. But when all of the other sort of functions of a society goes away or gives way, right, the only thing that's left, especially in sort of the aftermath of a war, is fear. And fear, you can only control that, right, if it's imminent and if it's directly related to your sense of safety. So the vast majority, for example, of let me not say the vast majority, I know for a fact that a lot of women in Somalia, for example, myself included, right, wear a bit more clothes or certain types of clothes because it's now socially expected, right? And if you didn't compromise in certain things, you would feel viscerally uncomfortable, right? And of course it's a shame, but put it in a sort of grander scheme of things, I understand it, and so far in my personal life I've been able to sort of negotiate with it, right? It's not ideal, but such is the lay of the land. Now I think it will change as things inevitably change that are to do with fear, with the more stability people have, right? Because it's kind of almost, you know, sort of the pyramid of need. You know, when your belly's satisfied, you think of the next thing, right? You know, roof over your head. When that is satisfied, you think of meaning, and, you know, so it goes so on and so forth. And I think, you know, I now feel in the sort of few years I've been living in Somalia, I have witnessed a change, especially with young people, even the way that they dress. It's more evident, of course, in guys, but even within, you know, the girls. So I think expression like that hopefully will inevitably sort of kind of correct itself, because also there's a confluence of many things that have just been layered, right? So the idea, for example, on, you know, you expected to dress a certain way, so you justify that you're a believer or you're pious or like this. So basically, your akhlaq, your demeanor, your personality has been confounded with this idea of one way, there's only one acceptable way of looking, especially if you're a woman, right? To then justify you're a good person. So these they've become signifiers for worth, right? How you dress, especially for women. And because it's only one acceptable way, you know, I deduce that is quite oppressive. Just because of that, if there was, you know, let's say 5 or 6 different ways that were acceptable. For example, one of the first things that really surprised me was, so growing up in Europe, when I think of hijab, for example, for me, a hijab is like, you know, a scarf. When you wrap, you know, yourself with a scarf, not a small one, like a scarf, you know, hijab, a head on tie. Now, in Mogadishu, hijab doesn't mean the hijab I know, right? It's considered you're only wearing a hijab when you're wearing what I call a jalabib. Now, for me, that's beyond hijab. That's jalabib haram tahay. So there's even, kind of the description of things. So some people might be of the opinion that as a woman, you're only really dressed hijab wa hijaban tahay, marka jalabib haratit, which for me isn't the case. Hada qamar haram tahay, for me, wali wa hijaban tahay. For example, hijab wa but I also think that if you didn't wear a scarf, you would still somehow be hijaban, because for me, it's personality and it's how you carry yourself. So again, it's all relative, and it really is to do with, our own sensibilities, I guess. But as a collective now, and just if you even look back on kind of historical posters or photograph or even family albums we have, people looked vastly different before the war. Yeah. Than they do now. Now, I also am not in the camp that says that, oh, it's wrong. No, I think that would be very reductionist to say that everything post-war is also wrong. No, we are exactly where we are now, given everything we've been through, everything that's happened, given the resources people have, and X, Y, and Z, we find ourselves where we are now. And in history, that's exactly where we should be now. So I'm much more interested and sort of orientated in co-creating and imagining better futures than I am lamenting at time lost and things that were lost in the war. Because again, I also feel, especially for young people, it's a really starving and really reductionist sort of place to go from. And that constantly leaves people in a sense of scarcity. So the future, I always say that our future is in the making, and I really believe that. And that's why for me, creativity is so important, because it's the act of making, creating, thinking, right? And yeah, it's still in the making. We can't, this paradigm of before the war and the war, I think is so reductionist and actually quite harmful. We need to ourselves now get out of this mentality that there's only two sort of spaces for us to exist, right? The here and now exists, it's here. So how can we collectively imagine better futures, better, responsible, just futures, right? It's a dialogue. And also when you're willing to have that dialogue with people, you're also showing that you have appreciation and respect and sort of willingness to sort of meet them somewhere, right? So I think that's kind of how I really think of my whole living in Mogadishu. Like, again, I'm going to be really cliche and say another saying, when they say, about Gandhi said, be the change you want to see. Like, no joke, that's been exactly like how I've kind of operated in Somalia. Like, I haven't often looked around and thought, oh, this and this isn't possible here. Because again, people would be surprised to know, like, Somali people are like any other people that you find anywhere else. Yes, we come with our particular set of different cultural expressions and norms and sensibilities and principles, right? But we're humans at the end of the day. So I think also assuming what's possible and not possible is not helpful, right? It's really, for me, it's been very interesting to kind of talk to people directly or collaborate with them and test things out. Like, there were a lot of people who said SAF wasn't possible in Somalia. Look at SAF now, and it's only been possible because of the support of local people in Hamar in particular, where we're now mostly based. So I think anything can be possible so long as it's needed, it's wanted, right? And it's collaborative. So I think any of the amenities you spoke of before, whether it's a cinema, like SAF will have, inshallah, its own cinema as well, art house cinema, which we're sort of kind of formed across the foundation, the commercial gallery, the cinema, and the art institution, the Contemporary Art Institute, which is a training institute. But I believe all of that is possible. Absolutely, right? But of course, within the sort of the perimeter of the sensibilities on the ground now, right? And at least from SAF perspective, yes, we are a progressive institution, but we're also an institution that directly talks and navigates and involves in accordance with our audiences and our collaborators and, you know, the people that we actually want to talk to. Although we also have a global facing entity or a global facing sort of side, which all contemporary art institution in the world generally tends to have, because, you know, as much as you localize, you also want to be part of the global conversation. But honestly, I think there's so much possibility. And now, you know, I'm actually mostly filled with a sense of excitement, because we are, you know, I don't want to say a blank canvas, but the opportunities outweigh what's not possible in Somalia at the moment. You know, we're just reeling back from the conflict. Yes, there is the sad reality of insecurity and, you know, terrorism still there again. However, I think it's very exciting that with the sort of increased peace that we keep getting, with this sort of vibrant young population we have, I'm really excited to see how things, you know, change.
Ku kala naqrono meel wana